Okay, free then. To recap, the the human form that we've just been looking at, that idealized male, more often than not nude, represents larger ideas than just a beautiful sculpted form. The beautiful sculpted form, if rendered perfectly ideal, also comes with it the ideas of perfection in terms of truth, meaning true for all times and all people in all places, and moral goodness or excellence, known as arete. These are ideals that the Greeks tried to instantiate in their own lives. Each person tried to model themselves after these ideals. And of course, the exemplars of these ideals were the Greek heroes that you hear about in Greek mythology, which of course wasn't mythology for them at all. It was their form of religion. Female forms, except for the goddesses, are a little bit different, partially because the idea of the hero, more often than not in Greek tradition, is a male form, and also because women were not considered citizens in Greek culture the same way we would consider women citizens in our own culture. In other words, they didn't have the right to hold public offices or vote. They were, secondary citizens. So most of these sculptures that we see, as we said before, could be enduring votive sculptures. They could be manifestations of goddesses, and every once in a while a manifestation of a great female athlete. Um, but with that, also, the Greeks had an aversion, as we talked about before, to showing the female nude, at least all the way until we get to about the middle of the 300s BCE, the middle of the 4th century BCE. So if you look at this image that you have in front of you, you have the peplos kore off to the left-hand side, a very early kore form, very, again, archaic and schematic and not very natural in any way. And then you get a much later form, the kore from Chios here, who is a lot more idealized, a lot more naturalistic. And then we get, during the classical age, if you look at the figure over on the right-hand side, which is actually something that came off one of the temples on the Acropolis in Athens. You see Nike, who is the goddess of victory, and the right-hand woman of the goddess Athena, tying her sandals. And now you start to see a little bit of the female figure underneath these clinging drapery fragments, although not to the same degree as what you would see in the male form. So it doesn't progress, and it's not as important to the Greeks as the male form. But we do start to see indications of a body somewhat idealized. To be sure, you can actually gather a canon of proportions from this, but it is, without question, not as idealized as you get the male form. Ever seen from the side, it's a relief sculpture, of course. It remains pretty much the same until we get to the middle of the 4th century BCE, where you have for the first time this work by Praxiteles, who was one of the great sculptors of his time period. And this sculpture, which is again a Roman copy of a Greek original that has been lost, is the so-called Aphrodite of Cnidus. Aphrodite of Cnidus, according to Roman historians, created quite an uproar when it was first created. The stories have it that it was created for one patron, and then when that patron didn't accept it because it was a nude female form and this was questionable in terms of morals, it was bought by the people of Cnidus and put in its own temple. Now, whether that's true or not is left open to debate. But what you're witnessing here is something that becomes a major artistic form in the West later on, and that's the freestanding female nude, either in painting or in sculpture. So let's talk about what this means. In the context of Greece, Aphrodite was the goddess of love and the goddess of beauty, and frankly, the goddess of sex and the power of female sexuality. If you think of the Greek myths in which you've heard of Aphrodite, who in Roman times, of course, becomes the goddess Venus. What she does in order to assert her power is seduce people with her beauty. One of her most famous stories, of course, is the story of the awarding of the golden apple. This is the Judgment of Paris story. And so I'll give you a little bit of an indication of this so that you can have a sense of what people of this time would have thought of her. In the story, the way it unfolds is that the Greek gods are all having a big wedding party up on Mount Olympus when one goddess is snubbed. She's not invited, and she happens to be the goddess of strife, of all things, of course. It's a big moralizing lesson. And when, excuse me, when she's not invited, she decides to seek a certain amount of revenge by having a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," on it, for herself, and then she rolls this apple in on the banquet table. Immediately, all of the female goddesses up on Mount Olympus start arguing over who is the most beautiful of all the goddesses. And in the end, it comes down to three of the big goddesses. The goddess of wisdom and warfare, Athena. The goddess who is the queen goddess, the wife of Zeus, whose name is Hera. And the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty and sexual power. Now they all go to Zeus, who is the king goddess on Mount Olympus, and ask him to decide who is the most beautiful of them. And Zeus, for all his failings, and by the way, he has plenty, is smart enough to realize that if he chooses one of them, he will make enemies out of the other two. And of course, one of them is his wife. And so this is a no-win situation. So instead of making the decision himself, he sends Hermes, the messenger god, down with the golden apple to the young prince of Troy, whose name is Paris, who of course is the one who kills Achilles later on in the story, and gives him this task. And, in a way, this is Zeus siding with the Greeks over the Trojans because he must have known what would ensue. So, again, Paris is woken up from a nap, and the god Hermes tells him that Zeus has a task for him. He wants him to decide who the most beautiful goddess is. And like any mortal man faced with these three totally gorgeous goddesses, he's more than happy to make the decision, not thinking about the consequences. And so the three goddesses just clothe in front of him and show themselves off to him, but they're all just totally gorgeous, so he can't decide which one to award the apple to. And at this point, they begin to bribe him. Athena promises that he'll be the greatest warrior of all time, and Hera tells him he'll be the greatest statesman of all time, the greatest leader ever. But Aphrodite has the trump card. Aphrodite whispers in his ear that he can have any woman that he wants fall in love with him, and conjures up an image before him of Helen, the famous Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the most beautiful woman on earth, and he immediately falls in love and awards the apple to Aphrodite. The moralizing lesson of this is that Aphrodite seduces in order to get what she wants, and it's been one of those age-old ideas about women's power that then, of course, in later times is structured through the belief system of Christianity to turn her not from a goddess, or not into a goddess about sexuality, but into a goddess who's just about beauty. What we're seeing here is Aphrodite as if she's just climbed out of her bath and is getting ready to put on a robe, and we've caught her unaware. She's in a pose that becomes known as the Venus Pudica pose, Pudica, which means modest Venus pose, although I think we'll all agree that her covering gesture is half-hearted at best. She's pretending to be modest in a sense, but she really expects you to look at her and see how gorgeous she is, which is the whole power that she has here. It was originally created, look at her face here, this beautiful Greek face, a typical Greek goddess face, perfect symmetry, perfect organization upon ratios in the face. The eyes are directly in the center of the head. The bottom of the nose is exactly halfway between the eyes and the bottom of the chin. The lips, the parting of the mouth, is exactly 1/3 down from the bottom of the nose, and so forth. It was originally created, it went into an open temple, such as this, a round temple, a peripteral style with columns all around. But this was shaded by the bottom part of it was shaded by a low wall that didn't allow you to see, let's say, below the waist, which was seen as pretty risque even in this time in Greece. And she was worshipped. She was worshipped by women who wanted to gain more beauty. She was visited by women who wanted to have children because she became a patron saint of women in childbirth. And she was visited by many men who were, of course, very interested in seeing this beautiful, beautiful goddess, or at least as close to her likeness as they could get. And within 100 years or so of being created, this temple became a tourist spot for people all through Western Europe who would travel here to see her and gain her blessing or just gaze upon the most beautiful female form ever created. Many copies of this because the original no longer exists, but you can see the basic idea. The beautiful female form. The form is a little bit softer with not as much musculature, so that's one of the differences between them. And of course, it's a little bit more sinewy and erotic, which is, of course, the nature of Aphrodite herself. This is just another copy of this form. We need to backtrack a little bit to look at Athens and the major architectural example of this lecture, the famous Parthenon, which is the major structure that you see up here in the right-hand side on the Acropolis in Athens. So back to the beginning of this story. Remember, in 480 BCE, the Greeks have defeated the Persians once again, and they've established and continue to hold to the Delian League. In Athens, the leader of the time is named Pericles, and Pericles becomes kind of the figurehead for the Delian League, and Athens becomes the main center for all the Greek nations under Pericles. This will eventually create a lot of problems with another major force on the Greek mainland, the Spartan culture of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and will lead to the Peloponnesian Wars near the end of the century, where the entire Delian League collapses under its own weight, and Athens is no longer the center of things. But at this time, very much Athens is the center of things, and one can imagine Socrates up on the Acropolis teaching, and later Plato up on the Acropolis teaching. The entire structure of the Acropolis, this new rebuilding of the Acropolis, was all undertaken during the time of Pericles, starting in 480 BCE and running all the way through 430 or so, 420 BCE. See, the Acropolis had been largely destroyed right before this by the Persians. The Acropolis is a high outcropping in Athens and was the site of one of those Mycenaean cities way back when, and had been a sacred site to the patron goddess of Athens, who is Athena. Kind of a no-brainer, easy to remember that, Athena in Athens here. And the Parthenon is, by and large, a temple to Athena. Now, in addition to the Parthenon, you get the Erechtheion over here that we'll see a little bit of, and the Propylon up here. This is the entrance to the sacred site of the Acropolis, and other little Templar structures around it. This is a reconstructed drawing, of course. It's much destroyed. You can see this just kind of laid out this way. The Greeks, as you will have read, do not center their temples on axis to the propylon or the area into the sacred space. They're a little bit off to the side, and you have to enter them through a series of angles until you get right up to the temple itself. But all this kind of entryway with the steps up to it, the propylon, and this other little entryway to the Acropolis are all ways of making that space sacred. What the Acropolis or the Parthenon looks like today. It's a massive structure. It's the biggest temple and the most complex temple ever created, and it was created again as an exemplary architectural structure to the Delian League and the coming together of Greek culture. It combines elements of the Doric style with elements of the Ionic style. It keeps Doric columns with their lack of much in the way of capitals intact. And it has triglyphs and metopes, but in addition to that, along the interior of this area here, the architrave, is a continuous frieze. And we'll see some examples of that showing the Panathenaic Procession. Now, in your reserve readings, you'll read that, of course, most of the sculpture from the Acropolis was taken by the British. In their minds, they were preserving it, but these days the Greeks want it back, and it has created a decades-long feud between the government of Greece and the government of England, who owns these sculptures and who should have them. On, just like you saw earlier in the temple buffet earlier today, you see it's a peripteral style, columns all the way around the outside. In this case, instead of 6 across the front and 12 down the side, like you saw at the Temple of Athena at Aegina, in this case, you have, let's see, 9 across the front and let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 along the sides here. In the middle of this whole thing is the cella with the sacred space. The very back space in the Parthenon is where the religious sculpture actually was housed. And in the front, as you'll see, is the place where the Elephantine sculpture to Athena was created and housed, which is a really interesting story, by the way. Looking at this, we'll get up close on this massive, massive sculpture, architecture, and created with a ton of what are known as refinements. Refinements are devices used by Greek sculptors and Greek architects in order to either solve for failings of human vision or to exacerbate them. So for instance, famously, the Parthenon, if you were to stand at one end of this stylobate, let's say you were standing here and your friend was standing at the other side of it, it curves up in the middle almost 18 inches so that you can see your partner at the other end from about the knees down or so. And the reason for that is if you look at a long continuous line, and it's a very long line, it will appear to sag to human vision. So they corrected for this by making it kind of curve in the middle. In addition to this, the columns at the corners are a little bit thicker than the columns on the interior to give it a little bit more solidity. Another refinement is that these columns tip in at the corners and tip back at the corners to make it appear even bigger than it actually was. Making it appear like it's slanting in would give it the sense of converging lines even more. As I said before, this is a sculpture to Athena. In the pediment on one side, so that triangular shape at the front of a building, you have the birth of Athena on one side, and on the other side, the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the patronage of Athens. The ancient myths had it that both of these gods wanted Athens as their own, and they both offered the Athenians gifts. Poseidon, supposedly, and there's a rock, if you go to the Acropolis and look, that they still believe is the original rock. Poseidon apparently hit that rock with this trident and caused a spring to form there, giving them water. And there is an old spring on the Acropolis, by the way, which is why it was so well suited to Mycenaean culture. Athena, on the other hand, according to most legends, gave the Greeks something that they needed even more, and something that's a huge part of their economy, which is the olive tree. She gave them an olive tree, and she won Athens for herself. The metopes on all sides have to do with setting the Greeks apart from what the Greeks called barbarians. Anyone who wasn't a Greek was considered a barbarian. The Greeks were really fairly egotistical in this manner. And so we see, for instance, on one side, the Centauramachy, which is the battles against the centaurs by the Greeks. On the other side, and these are all the metopes, 32 of them on each side, you see the sack of Troy, the battle of the Greeks against the Trojans. On the other side, you see the battle against the Amazon culture, which we saw there in the Greek vase painting, where Achilles battled Panathenaic. And then on the final side, you see the battle of the Greek gods against the giants, who are the preceding gods of Greece. So it's all about the Greeks asserting themselves over others, over barbarians. On the interior of this is a continuous frieze known as the Panathenaic Procession frieze. We won't go into all the specifics of this, but the Panathenaic Procession was a ritual that was done every 2 or 3 years in order to reinvigorate their ties to Athena. It was a huge, gathering of people from all over Athens to come pay tribute to the goddess Athena and to reinvigorate their connections to her. Sculptures then in the, as you've seen before, have to do with the in this case, the competition between Poseidon and Athena. There are very few of these sculptures left, right? And so we have primarily gods and goddesses who are reclining here and there with the central figures. If you look at the reconstruction, these have all been lost, of Poseidon and Athena. These are all housed, by the way, in the British Royal Museum, much to the chagrin of the Greeks. Huge sculpture, deeply carved, full of lots of motion, probably representing the gods witnessing this competition between the figures. And at each end, you have chariot horses rising out of those corners of the pediment, and you can just imagine what the impact of this might have been originally. Reclining figures at the edge, male nudes. They're in this deteriorated state because they were out in the elements of nature for hundreds of years before they were collected, actually thousands of years. And the clinging folds of the drapery on the figures to indicate that perfect body underneath, but because of the mores of the time, not to show it yet. So here we have reconstructive of battle, or this competition between Poseidon and Athena here, and Poseidon with his trident. Again, we don't have any of these sculptures, by the way. Poseidon with his trident and Athena sprouting forth, an olive tree behind him. There's the spring that he caused to come forth. These are one of the most interesting parts of this. The metaphys, as I said, show the Greek triumph over their others or over barbarians. And it's clear that they were carved by a number of different sculptures with different degrees of ability. This is one of the, battles of the centaurs against the Greeks here. And it's never clear, entirely which side is winning. And that's because the Greeks wanted to show that these battles weren't easily fought. That it took a lot of work on the part of the Greeks to actually subdue their enemies, or in this case, to subdue metaphorically their pathos, their emotional impulses, and to create the ethos or rational Greek that they all wanted to be. In this case, it looks like a Greek is losing, for instance, and we see that as, unlike this sculpture that has really, really kind of deep musculature, this one's a little bit softer. Or this beautiful form here, not really so much a battle scene than a way to display the beauty of the human anatomy, which is that idealized form. On the interior, all the way around the interior frieze of the Parthenon is the Panathenaic Procession, which I'll just show you a couple of examples of. Again, these show the ritual enactments of this major religious ceremony for Athena. And if you look up, you'll see you've got the idealized male form here. Even the horses are idealized based upon canons of proportions. And it just continuously goes around the entire interior. Those kind of monumental, incredible sculptures that originally existed within the Parthenon was the so-called Elephantine sculpture to Athena, or the Athena Parthenos. Which was created around 438 BCE, right before the first of the major Peloponnesian Wars, and which eventually Greece will be fragmented again for a time until Alexander the Great brings them all together again. This sculpture was a huge, monumental, sculpture in the entranceway the to the Parthenon. And behind this, if you can imagine doors here, they lead to the more sacred realm of Athena. What's so cool about this sculpture is that it was created all completely out of luxury items or precious metals or gems or ivory or gold or all of them used together in order to glorify Athena, but even more importantly, to create an emblem of a unified Greece. Athena here has her characteristic components, a shield, a symbol of a snake here behind it that refers to the story of the Medusa, a spear over her shoulder, which was the primary weapon used by the Greeks. And then she holds in her hand a symbol of victory, the goddess Nike, which literally means victory if you're wondering where that shoe brand got its name originally. She was made out of precious materials over a wooden armature because, believe it or not, she was considered to be a treasury. All of the monies that were collected, or a good deal of the monies collected by Athens, from the Delian League, from all of these other poli all throughout Greece, some of those were melted down and turned into this sculpture or combined to create this sculpture, with the idea being that here it showed the unification of Greece by everyone kind of pooling in their monies and glorifying the idea of a triumphant, victorious Greece. Athena, remember, is the god of wisdom and warfare, and they had beaten the overwhelming Persians, not just through their own athletic prowess, but through their brain power, through their tactics. But the other side of this was, it was always known that should Greece need money in order to fight back the Persians or someone else again, you could always take a piece off the Athena Parthenos, a big chunk of gold, and turn that back into coinage so as to pay for that war. She was literally understood to be a treasury. What she looked like, because many, many miniatures were created of her, including this one made out of ivory. These were kind of like tourist items. You could go to Athens and buy little facsimiles of the Athena Parthenos. The coolest portraits is this. I just couldn't help but show it to you. This is the Erechthion's, I think it's its west porch, where the columns are created. And this is an Ionic Temple. The columns are created using human figures known as caryatids. And it's just like the coolest thing you've ever seen. So I wanted to show you this as well. It's a smaller, more minor temple off to the side of the Parthenon. This is a reconstructed drawing of the Panathenaic Procession, where droves of people would come in and ceremonies would be performed to reinvigorate the connections between the patron goddess and the people. Move forward in time just for a few later works of art from the so-called Hellenistic period of Greece. The Hellenistic period is the period after the emergence of Alexander the Great. Many of you know that Alexander the Great, who was the son of Philip II of Macedon, the area that's in the northern kind of proximity to Greece, establishes his dominance. Philip starts it, but Alexander continues this dominance over the Greek mainland by the mid, 330s or so. And part of course, Alexander the Great's triumphs had to do with him extending the Greek Empire all the way to Egypt on the one hand and India on the other hand, and into contemporary what is known as France today, where he fought the Gauls, as they were known back then. And one of the sculptures that we have parts of remaining, although again, these are Roman copies after probably bronze originals, come from a monument to his triumphs over the Gaul people, known as the Monument of Attilos. The Monument of Attilos was probably created by the sculptor Epigenes, although we're not entirely sure of that. And this is a reconstructive drawing of what it probably looked like altogether based upon Roman accounts of this sculpture. The Roman copies that we have left to us are these. This is the famous Gallic chieftain killing himself and his wife from, again, these are meant to commemorate Alexander's victories, um, created somewhere around 230 BCE, so well after Alexander's reign. And in this sculpture, what you're looking at is a really good example of Hellenistic sculpture, much later sculpture. So from the 300s to the 200s, all the way to the first century BCE, Greek sculpture changed quite a bit. It still held on to the idea of the ideal human form. It still has perfect human proportions, but now it adds a level of theatricality, much more movement to the forms, much more dynamic. These things are meant to be, inspire your emotional response to them. So things have changed from the time when everything was stoic and severe, like the Doryphoros. In this case, the Gallic chieftain is killing himself and he's already killed his wife so as to avoid capture. It's a way for the Greeks to show how formidable their opponents were that they triumphed over, just as we saw on the Parthenon earlier on. I'll show you a couple of examples of this. A bit more dynamic. Again, some of this is already evidenced in the late classical works that we saw, such as the Apoxymenos by Lysippus, but it's gotten even further along that way. There's a lot more movement to these figures. They show a great deal more expression. They certainly incite more of our emotional response. Look at the kind of flowing cape behind this man and the twisting form and all of the jutting of the leg out into the space and so forth. These are meant to feel like they're in motion and catch you up in the theater. Tell a Gaul, by the way, in sculptors who are one of their major enemies because they have this really kind of chunky looking hair. The Gauls used to put chalk in their hair, and that is being stylized here in the way that he depicts hair. The Gauls also had mustaches, and so you see a mustache on this form, and most Greeks, well, there are different time periods, but they're either fully shaven or they have a very short beard. Very rarely do you see someone with just a mustache. So that indicates that he's a Gaul. Culture that we have a good Roman copy of from this monument is the so-called Dyeing Gaul, or the Dyeing Trumpeteer. The trumpeteer, of course, being the person who trumpets or blows a horn for the army. And in this case, he's been wounded, as you can see in the side. This is stylized blood pouring out of there, giving you an idea of his last moments. He has that chalked hair, and you'll see a mustache on him as well. He's dropped his sword, and it's kind of the last moments before he lays down to die. And again, this is supposed to be very theatrical and moving and kind of catch you up in the heroic last moments of this great enemy or formidable opponent to the Greeks. And it's subtle, to be sure, but you still get a sense of emotion on the faces, the furrowed brow, the kind of looking down at the ground, the slightly parted mouth that was not to be found in the Doryphoros. That was all about the idea of ethos. Here we get a little bit more pathos. And it doesn't hurt that, of course, these are not Greeks. These are non-Greeks that can show some of that emotion. Another very famous Hellenistic sculpture is, of course, the Nike of Samothrace, or the Winged Victory of Samothrace, as she's oftentimes called. It's from probably around 190 BCE. It comes from the city of Samothrace, which is a port city. It's huge, right? It's about twice life size here, all carved out of marble with these flowing garbs and, like it's being blown by the wind back onto her. And that makes perfect sense because when this was originally created, from, again, descriptions by the Romans, it was above the harbor, looking out onto the harbor itself where the wind would blow up and into this space. And below it was a pool of water with a fountain that would spray up as if she was at the front of a giant ship and the water was splitting before her as she rode off into victory. This is in the Louvre, of course, as many of these sculptures that you've been seeing are, in a pride of place in the Louvre, where you can see this if you get to Paris sometime. Here's another example of looking at it straight on. Unlike earlier classical Greek sculptures, we see a lot more twisting movement to the figure, a lot more idea about, the impact of wind against the very diaphanous or tight-fitting, probably silk that is over abdomen here. It's supposed to look like something that's in movement. It's supposed to be something that's a little bit more theatrical than just that original, very idealistic Doryphoros that we saw. Finally, one of my favorite of all the Hellenistic sculptures. Your book is taking a shot, your text is, at identification of who the sculptors are. I didn't put that on your lecture guide because it's still quite controversial. We don't know when this was originally created or who the sculptor really was. We have a very famous, or probably Roman copy of the original, but scholars are divided as to whether this was created in the 1st century BCE or even the 1st century CE, in the Common Era. It was actually discovered in Rome, believe it or not, during the time of the Renaissance, during the age of Michelangelo, and when everyone was in a craze about finding these types of things. So we don't really know much about it. But it's an amazing sculpture, you have to agree. And the story that is being told here through these forms, which again are all idealized, the main figure in the middle is Laocoon, and the 2 other figures are his sons, comes from the Trojan War. Many of you know that the Trojan War was this battle that was between the Trojans out there in kind of the northern climes of Persia during this time period and the Greek mainland. And it was a battle that took place because after that story of Aphrodite being awarded the golden apple, Paris went to Greece and he absconded with Helen, who happened to already be married. And by the way, when she got married to Menelaus, in a Greek chieftain, all the Greeks were, of course, vying for her. Everyone wanted to be the husband of this most beautiful of all women. And so when she did pick Menelaus, all the Greeks agreed that they would fight anyone who tried to steal her away from Menelaus. They did not know that it would be a Trojan who would do this. So when she leaves with Paris and goes back to Troy, the Greeks organize and go to fight the Trojans, and Achilles is their main warrior, and you saw Ajax was another of the warriors, and Odysseus was the smart guy in this whole story, and they battle over and again, on and off for 10 years, and neither side is really winning. It goes one way for a while, then another way for a while, until finally Odysseus decides that he'll come up with a plan, and his plan is to create a giant wooden horse, hollow on the inside, and leave it on the shore as an offering to Poseidon for safe passage home. And what he's hoping, of course, is that the Trojans will take this horse inside the walls to their city, which is why the Greeks can't win, they can't breach the city. And soldiers hidden inside this hollow horse will sneak out in the middle of the night and open the gates to the rest of the Greeks. Now that's exactly what happens, but not before this episode in the story. A priest of Troy named Laocoon, when seeing the Trojan horse, as it became known, tries to tell the rest of the Trojans not to bring this into the city. See, the Trojans, on the one hand, they want to destroy this thing because they want to destroy this offering that the Greeks have made to Poseidon so that they won't get a safe passage home. But they don't want to destroy it because what if that pisses off Poseidon, frankly? And so they're kind of hemming and hawing. What should they do? Should they leave it there? Should they bring it into the city? And Laocoon says, just push it into the ocean, just leave it alone. But whatever you do, don't bring it into the city. This is, it's not a good thing. And while he's making this argument and people are kind of hemming and hawing this way or that, Poseidon, who's on the side of the Greeks in this whole battle, and by the way, the gods have kind of sided, some with the Trojans, some with the Greeks, and so forth. Poseidon sends two serpents from the sea to attack Laocoon and his family to shut him up. And when the Trojans see this, they fear that they have greatly, angered Poseidon, and they bring the Trojan horse eventually into the city. And of course, Odysseus and his men are hidden inside, and that wins the war for him. So what we're witnessing here is incredibly theatrical, right? In a way, here's a man who was absolutely right. Laocoon was right to distrust this this gift, and yet he is dying nonetheless in a horrible way, along with his sons. Isn't life unfair? So it goes, right? Isn't this being at the mercy of the gods? Isn't this the nature of free will versus fate? I mean, it's all these big ideas, all encapsulated in this incredibly dynamic theatrical sculpture that I'll show you a couple of close-ups of. Its face is the classical stoicism of Doryphoros, and replacing it is this Hellenistic, very pathos-filled, life's unfair kind of expression, accompanied with that incredibly idealized form of the male body that is all about truth, goodness, and beauty, right? The truth of all things. If you look down here at his sons, you'll see they're equally distraught about things, and that series of serpents wrapping around their legs, catching them up, wondering, did dad do the right thing? Did dad do the wrong thing? What are we to believe? How are we to respond to all of this? Case is the lecture on the part 3 of the lecture on Greek sculpture. I hope it was enjoyable to you, and I will see you next week for Roman art. Roman art, of course, just to give you a heads up, Roman art, the Romans basically loved everything Greek, and they adopt all the Greek gods and all the Greek stories and Greek styles of sculpture and so forth, but they combine it with their own very militaristic, very individualistic culture to create an entirely new form of art. All right, until then, I'll see you.